Hello, welcome to the Disciplinary Literacy Universal Classroom Instruction slideshow. Today we're going to go over 7 points of literacy instruction that can happen in any secondary classroom. We brought together a group of secondary teachers, both junior high and high school teachers, to discuss what literacy instruction can look like in the secondary schools and within classrooms within those schools, no matter what the subject is. Now, before we get going into this slideshow, I just want to be able to put reading back into its place again. Our goal is not to improve reading. It is actually to improve learning, and reading is important to that. If we can take kids' reading levels and increase them, or help them understand the literacy of our subjects better, then we will be able to use that skill within the kids to be able to help them do better within the classes that they are learning about. So that said, our goal is not to use social studies to improve reading. It's more about using the literacy of social studies to improve how kids are doing within that class. So as we talk about literacy instruction, our minds often can go to two different places. We'll have two different types of students sitting in front of us. We'll have students that are struggling readers, and we'll have some students that are already reading at grade level. So we need to be aware of both and what our plan is for both of them. With our struggling readers, we definitely need to be aware of what are we doing to help them close that gap. Is there a way that we can find texts, no matter what the class we're in, that are more at their reading level so that we can give them strategies to use to be able to practice reading with those texts so that their reading levels can go up so that they can be at reading level with their peers. Now, we also know that we're going to have a whole bunch of kids sitting in front of us that are already reading at grade level. Now, what are we doing with those kids to be able to help them continue to increase their reading level? And what are we doing to help them handle texts that are put in front of them that are maybe above their reading level? So we know that definitely all of the diplomas and PATs are not designed with reading levels in mind. We ran a question from, I believe it was a biology diploma, through a Lexile analyzer, and it came back as a grade 17 level question. So we know that even the kids that are sitting in front of us reading at grade level need that help with being taught balanced strategies of how do I increase my comprehension based on this discipline so that I can handle those higher level texts. And so as I go through this slideshow, I'm actually not talking really much at all about the left side of this screen and the struggling readers. I'm actually more talking about what do we do with the kids that are already reading at grade level so they can handle the types of texts that are put in front of them as we continue our instruction within those disciplines. So this is one of my favorite slides to be able to shift our thinking about what disciplinary literacy actually is. So when I first started learning about literacy, my mind was very much kind of in the idea of how do I use science to be able to teach kids how to read better? How am I going to take the time within science to be able to teach kids reading? And I had to shift my mind from this idea of doing literacy in science and math in social studies and English, and have it shift more towards this idea of what is the literacy of science? What is the literacy of math? And as I learn what the literacy of science is how do I help kids see what that literacy looks like? And then how do I help them learn that literacy so that they can understand and achieve higher within literacy? So rather than using science to teach literacy, we switched it to how do we use the literacy of science to be able to teach science to the kids. We know that discipline literacy is a unique way of sharing information or a set of characteristic literacy practices within a profession. So whatever subject it is that you're teaching, you want to take a look at beyond high school and what are the jobs that can actually happen within that area. And within those jobs, how do people communicate with each other? And are we giving kids a chance to be able to communicate in a similar way? Can they read those sorts of things that are put in front of people within that profession and be able to make sense of those sorts of texts? And are they given chances to be able to practice their own communication in the same sort of way? And as they practice this, when they get those harder level questions put in front of them or those harder texts in front of them, then they will be able to have a chance to have seen how you think in that way and how you communicate in that way, and they'll be able to show their own learning better. So these 7 points that we're going to talk about in just a minute are built within this collaborative response model framework within our idea of what a quality learning environment is. Now, this secondary literacy group asked these questions, and the way that we worded these questions of what should be happening in every classroom and what should be happening in every math classroom, science classroom, social classroom, English classroom. It's a dangerous way to word those questions. Now, part of the purpose of the collaborative response model is to provide strategies to use with a struggling student. So in a collaborative meeting, during a discussion, as you're talking about a student that seems to be struggling, you can look and choose a strategy that will apply to the student. Now, the theory is that the lowest tiered intervention that works is best for the student. So a student shouldn't be moved up a tier until everything in the lower tier has proved ineffective. So the way that those questions are worded makes it seem like a teacher could use those answers to those questions as a checklist so that a student can be moved up. But if we are saying a kid needs help in literacy, we shouldn't be providing any extra supports until these things at the lower levels are happening in each classroom. If they aren't, we may actually be creating more struggling readers. So here are the answers that the Secondary Literacy Committee gave to these questions that are being asked. And the other thing that I want to point out last of all, before we get into this, is the intention of creating these 7 points of instruction, not so we have an observation checklist as we walk through classrooms to be able to see what is it that should be happening. The entire purpose is if you have a struggling student, what might not be happening for that kid that needs to happen before we move to a higher level of intervention supports. So here's the first of the 7 points that this committee came up with for what can happen within any secondary classroom for literacy instruction to happen. Now that said, before I really delve into this point, the last thing to point out is, as the committee made these points, there was things to talk about within each of these points that needed to be explained in order for them to be truly clear. And I'm going to go through each of those explanations as I go through this point, and then I'll stop after each one of these sections so that you can have a discussion within whatever group you're sitting in, and hopefully those discussions will help you see how it can apply into the classroom that you're teaching. So point number 1 is to hear a fluent adult read and interpret disciplinary text. So the first thing to talk about within this is the idea of modeling. So when we hear a fluent adult reading, we can see what it's supposed to sound like, and to be able to, and it gives the students a clear goal of what it is that they want to be able to sound like as they're reading. Now, I don't want to focus too much on the idea of reading out loud here. The point that we're trying to make with this modeling is that sometimes, especially with narrative text, when we read out loud, it can sound very fluent. But the other thing is, if you're reading a science text out loud or a math text out loud, one of the things that we're modeling is fluent reading within those subjects is not always as fluent as what we expect when we're within a narrative text. So there's a difference between being completely fluent and working through a productive struggle so that students can hear that in expository texts, it's not always this nice, fluent, smooth reading that's happening. It's choppy, it pauses, you have to go back to figure things out and to connect ideas, and it's important for them to see what that looks and sounds like as you're modeling that to them. Even within math or science, or really in any class, if you have some sort of graph in front of them or not your traditional sort of text full of words, what does it look like when you're fluently working through your thinking with those sorts of texts in front of you? Now, the idea of seeing that interpret disciplinary text, that's really key, that when a student hears that, that they're able to see your thinking through something called the Think Aloud. Now, the Think Aloud will likely be covered in another lesson, but in short, it's really how do you get your thinking so that it's out loud so students can hear it. And as you're first learning to do these, they're a little bit awkward, but as you can start saying your thoughts out loud and letting kids see it, then they'll see what it's like to actually work through that text. There's one bit of research out there that actually shows, well, it argues, I guess, that you can't actually teach comprehension skills to kids. You can only model them. And while I do believe there's a limit to that idea, I like what it's saying is if you can model it for the kids, they can see what it looks like so that they can start to interpret it themselves. And the last thing is just to remember that different types of texts happen in different disciplines. There are more graphs in math and science. Social studies is going to have a lot more historical language in their texts. They might even have a lot more of those cartoons, the political cartoons as you go through them. And what does your thinking look like? And what does it look like when a fluent adult is working through that so that the kids can see, okay, here's what I need to do, and here's how my teacher actually works through this. And if I can think in a similar way, I might be able to understand this in a similar way as I work through that. So at the end of that point, I want you to go to the next slide. And in this slide, there are 3 questions that I want you to discuss. So we'll pause the slideshow at this point. But I want you to ask yourself, is it realistic to ask that this be done in middle school and high school classrooms? And is it realistic that we can ask that this happens for every kid in every class every day? Is there a way that reading can be modeled and shown to the kids? Also, I want you to discuss, is this already happening in your classrooms? And if it is there any way it can be tweaked so that it can be used more purposefully within those classrooms? So we'll stop now and let you have that conversation. Now, point number 2 is the point that this literacy committee that came up with these points was most nervous about. It may be the one that brings up the most amount of emotion as we work through this one. So this point is that students should be provided with accessible text and or supported when text is beyond their independent level. Now, there's 2 parts to this, but they really needed to be combined so that the explanation could happen together. In an ideal classroom, even beyond English language arts, in every subject out there, it's ideal if a student can be provided with a text that's on a similar content that's at their level, so that they can still practice reading and be able to gain that content learning for themselves through that text. And if they are doing that with the text at their level, it's also providing them practice with reading at their level, which will increase their reading and start to close that gap a bit. Now, we have to be aware of all types of kids within this sort of thing, with this sort of idea of providing multi-level text. There are some students with a true learning disability, so their cognitive understanding is high and they can understand the same sort of content within the class as anyone else, but their reading levels might be lower. And so we need to balance that idea of giving them text at their level so that we can close that gap with what are the accommodations that they need in order to be able to fully understand the content that needs to be understood to be able to pass that class successfully. And what is the area of challenge, the area of difficulty for that student? And what are the strategies that we are teaching them and giving them so that they can be able to overcome a lack of skill in inferring or summarizing or predicting or whatever it happens to be in that area? Are we giving them those strategies? Now, one of the English teachers in that room actually brought up something, and it was very closely echoed by a science teacher in the room. It's the idea of sometimes it is just not possible to simplify the text that we're working with. We can't find a text that's at a lower level that has the same content. And if we actually take the text that we really want and need them to understand and simplify it, sometimes we lose meaning when we simplify the text. The English teacher was saying, I seem to have this incredibly sophisticated text or a graphic novel and I have nothing in between. Or the science teacher was saying, like, I don't know how to take the word oxidation and make that more simple. Like, I need the student to understand that word, and I need them to be able to use that word in order for them to accomplish what this course is actually asking them to do by the end of the course. And it's key that we are okay with that at times, because as we put a text in front of a kid that uses those words or that highly sophisticated text, what are we doing to help that kid understand the content of that text so they can still pass the course? Now, I want to make sure here that I didn't just give permission to ignore the left side of this slide. There's a point to being able to understand kids, or help kids understand the content so they can pass the course, while balancing that with using things on the left side, that ideal side. But the key here is if we are actually putting that text that is beyond their independent or even their instructional level in front of them, we're probably not teaching them how to read anymore. We are now accommodating them so that they can pass the course and understand the content. But it's okay that is our focus at times. That needs to happen too, especially with that true LD profile of a student, that they can understand the content there. So, and it's the same sort of things here. You can need to provide them with the accommodations, with the assistive technology that they need in order to be able to become independent, with being able to remove those barriers without having to go to somebody all the time. They need the metacognitive strategies taught to them so they know if they've lost understanding and how to go back and fix what's going on. And the last thing that we need to be able to help them with is the idea of text structure. Sometimes a student with a learning disability or even an executive functioning disorder, or a student that's low cognitive, could be very useful to that student if we can provide them with text structure. Give them some sort of graphic organizer that will help them to organize their thoughts around text as they read it, so they can see the connections between the things that they read. And the graphic organizers will be able to help them organize that thinking so that they can recall it again at a later time. So now with that discussion, let's go to those same questions again. Back into your groups, just have the same conversation around, is it realistic to ask that this be done in a middle school or a high school? Is this happening already in your classrooms? And if it is, how can we use it to be more purposeful in helping our kids either understand the content and or balance that with being able to increase their reading levels at the same time? Okay, point number 3 is that students have access to daily reading of their choice to become lifelong readers. So the points to discuss within this idea is that one, that developing a love of reading is vital. We know that if the more kids read outside of school, the more that they enjoy reading, it's really correlated to higher levels of achievement. And we have to be able to focus on what we can affect within the school, within the classroom, and what do we do to be able to develop that love of reading. And if kids can develop a love of reading and want to read, then they will be able to get lots and lots of reading practice, which increases vocabulary and increases their skills to be able to unconsciously understand the text that's in front of them. And it's that love of reading that keeps them going. If we get those students that really hate reading, or as Penny Kittle sometimes calls it, the dormant readers, the kids that can read but don't, it's a lot harder to get them to engage in the text. So sometimes we have to take a step backwards and figure out, what can I do to help this kid learn how to love reading again, so that we can get them to be able to, on their own, actually build up their own reading skills, as well as just inherently cover a lot more words in the language, which will help them understand things a lot more. And built into that, developing a love of reading, is the idea of being able to choose their own books, so that they can be able to just develop that love of reading and see all the different genres that are out there. Now, we know that this is almost always thought of as that dear reading or free read within a school. It seems that we think that is where a kid can choose their own book so that they can read it. And that is accurate. That's actually a really good time for kids to be able to choose their own books. Now, that third point here, the idea of nudging is okay and not to have strict rules. Sometimes we can get so rigid around this idea of letting kids choose, but their book has to be at their own level. We need to, which is a really good thing, but we need to remember one of the things that Allington points out is that interest should always trump reading level. So as students, if they choose a book that's seems like it's way too hard for them, but they want to be able to kind of dig through it themselves because they're so interested in what the book is about, that's a good thing. Let's let them do that. The idea is most of the books that they choose should be around their reading level, and how can they choose their own book so that it's useful to them and to increase in their reading level. But the real struggle that sometimes we have is when we have a student that is regularly and consistently reading books that are below their reading level. That is not doing anything to help that kid move forward. So we need to be careful to not restrict them to the point that we're killing their love of reading, but we need to understand that it is okay that we're nudging them up and helping them sometimes move beyond their regular type of book and helping them move to their higher levels and understanding. Now, the last thing here too, and this is especially when we're not talking about free reading, we need to understand that sometimes choice is limited, and that if you put two texts in front of a kid and they have to choose one, that is still a choice. So I don't think we have to go out and find 100 different types of text so that they have choice within science class and you get to go read whatever it's about. Sometimes you need them to focus in on a content. And if you can even provide any sort of choice around, hey, I want you to read this text, or when we're applying something within chemistry and I want you to read about this sort of job or this sort of job, those sorts of things are useful because it still gives kids choice, but that choice can be limited too so that they can focus in areas that we need them to be focused on. Now again, after this point, it's the same sort of discussion within your group. Is it realistic that we can ask that choice for reading happen within middle schools and high schools? Is it happening already in your classrooms? And how can we use it more purposefully? The next point within the idea of literacy within all of the subject area classrooms in every secondary classroom is about writing purposefully every day. Now, I actually don't really have a lot to say about this one, but the question of what does purposefully mean comes up sometimes. Like if I teach something and put a worksheet in front of a kid, can we count that as purposefully? And the answer to that one usually is no. So writing purposefully means that there needs to be, somehow it needs to be authentic to the student, or they need to generate it or be creative. And I'm not trying to say every class needs to have creative writing. I'm just trying to say that writing in class every day will help a kid actually process what it is that they've been learning, especially if they're generating it from their own thoughts or summarizing things. And as they generate that writing, that will be able to help them actually write to learn, and they will be able to understand things better in the future. And so you can put information in front of a student and have them work through that information and then be able to generate their own understanding and put it back to you. But if all it is they're answering questions that they can either draw from a book or draw from the lecture that you just gave, that should not count as purposeful writing. The purposeful writing should be more of open-ended questions that somehow they get to reflect and show you what it is that they've learned, or they can make connections beyond what you've talked about to the world or to other texts or to self, to other people. Those sorts of connections where they can see how it goes beyond just the direct lesson that was taught. The other thing that we wanted to point out, and this is just singling out math, but just sometimes writing is harder to see in math. Even the idea of making a graph in math can be seen as writing purposefully, as long as it's starting off and they have to generate it, not just filling in a worksheet where you're just putting on the points and drawing a line. It needs to go a bit beyond that too. How do I represent this set of data so that the kids can, how do the kids create the representation of it on a graph, and they're going through that thinking on their own, which connects to the idea of purposefully. So is it realistic that writing can happen in every middle school and high school classroom? Is it already happening? And how can it be used more purposefully? Point number 5 is to investigate or build the background knowledge of students in every class again. So the first thing here is let's not presume ignorance on the side of the kids. Let's investigate their background knowledge first to see if they actually have any understanding of what it is that we're talking about before we feel like we need to teach everything to them. If they have that background knowledge already, it can actually save us time. But 2, we know that they'll already understand that text better. Now, the second idea within this point is that we need to activate their background knowledge. Now, usually activating background knowledge happens before. If you can have a discussion around the content of the text and what's involved in it. And background knowledge can actually almost be synonymous with vocabulary. If they have the right background knowledge, usually they have the vocabulary that they need to understand what's going on within that text. And so we need to activate it, get them thinking in the right area before we put that text in front of them. Now, especially the English teacher wanted in the idea of sometimes background knowledge isn't activated until after the text is read. There are things that you almost want the kids to go in without the right perspective first, so that you can almost help them see different perspectives or help them shift perspectives as they're working through a text. So depending on the purpose, the activating can be done before or after. In most subject areas, it helps a student beforehand, but there are purposes that make it afterwards. Vocabulary is really key if you want to increase a student's reading level really fast. Vocabulary is something that can be focused on, and the more you can get a student to read, especially on their own, the faster their vocabulary will increase. Now, the science teacher in the room was saying, you know what, sometimes when there's a text or when there's a concept that we're learning, the kids just don't even have that background knowledge. When I'm talking about oxidation, their background knowledge on that just doesn't even exist. So the idea on that is, if it doesn't exist, sometimes the best you can do is activate their background knowledge on the previous foundational concept, so that then you can build the background knowledge for them before you get to the text. So if you give them the text to be where they start with learning about a new concept, they probably won't have the background knowledge or the vocabulary needed to understand that text. But if you help build on it first, whether you're using your demonstration first, or whether they have some sort of experiment or social experience within social studies, when those things happen first, and then the last activity is they have the chance to read a text, then they'll be able to understand that text better towards the end of it. And then after they read a text, if they wrap it up with summarizing, that would be the best way to work through that, whatever the summarizing activity is. But the idea of investigating their background first, so that you don't have to build any background knowledge that isn't necessary to build, activating it, and then sometimes building it if it's not there. Those things all matter usually before a text is read. So again, same 3 questions. Is it realistic that these things can be asked for within a middle and high school? Is it already happening in your classrooms? And if it is, how can you use it more purposefully? Point number 6 is that students, in order to maintain their at-level reading, need to read for 60 minutes and write for 40 minutes per day. Now, as this point comes up, nobody usually argues with the idea of more reading and writing is going to be useful for the kids, but some of the thoughts that come into our mind is, where do I find this time? And how do we get that much to actually happen and build the stamina in kids so that they can do that sort of thing? So the first idea here is that it can be broken up across the classes. So it's not saying 60 minutes and 40 minutes per kid per class. This is per day, so it can be broken up. Now, even that still seems like a lot. And if you happen to have a 20-minute deer period in your class or in your school, it takes it down to 40, and if there's 5 periods left, you can get it down to about 8 minutes of reading within a class. And even that, if you're teaching a subject that seems to have a lot of curriculum and you're feeling like 8 minutes per class is really hard to give up, I just want to go back and try to connect it to the idea of any of the points that we've talked about so far, or the last point that's going to come up next. If any of those things are happening as they're writing, or as they're listening to a fluent reader, or as they're working through either a higher level text or a text at their level, as they're using those texts to access content, All of those different things count towards these 60 minutes. And I'm not suggesting in any way that a school needs to track this sort of thing. I just think a teacher needs to take a look at this and say, in my class, are we getting on average this many minutes of students interacting with a text, going through it? And again, there's no silver bullet here. This has to be figured out within each school, within each classroom, of how do I use the literacy of this class to help them be able to increase their reading so that they can achieve better. Those are the sorts of things you want to stay connected to here so that you can get this to actually happen within the classroom. Not saying that finding this much time is easy. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here is we have talked about in a different point the idea of students choosing what they read. Not everything that a kid reads, especially in those subject level classes, gets to be their choice at all. They may have model texts put in front of them or mentor texts put in front of them so that they can see how a teacher reads, how a teacher thinks, and then they have other texts put in front of them so that they can be able to practice how a teacher thinks and uses the literacy of the class that they're in. So this also includes conversations around the text as you're talking about the things that are in those texts and helping students learn how to interpret them and be able to apply their own thinking to it. All of those things are included within this time. Now, the last point on here is if you have a student that is in the secondary schools and is falling behind into that targeted and into the individualized zone, those kids need beyond this amount of time in order for them to be able to close that gap. So it can be up to actually 90 minutes per day for those struggling readers so that they can learn how to use those strategies that, one, they're already behind in, and two, they might need more practice in than any other student. So it can take more time for them. So again, let's go to those same questions. Is it realistic for this to be asked to be done in middle schools and high schools? Is it already happening in your classrooms? And how can it be done more purposefully?